Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm the director of the IU Center for Bioethics and a professor of medicine at the School of Medicine. And I am thrilled to be here today to introduce Mark Fox, our speaker for the next episode, the next instance of our Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics seminars, TREATS seminars. And Dr. Fox will be speaking today about minimal risk and defining that in research and research ethics. Dr. Fox probably needs no introduction. Many know him. He's the director and associate dean of IU School of Medicine South Bend and director and associate dean, if I have it right, of the IU School of Medicine Northwest, Gary, as well, in addition to his professorships in medicine and pediatrics. He's also a longtime and stalwart member of our bioethics program of the Indiana CTSI, which hosts these translational research ethics seminars. And it is a thrill to have you here, Dr. Fox, and I'll hand the floor over to you. Thank you again.
Sure. Thanks, for the opportunity to address this topic that really grows out of a specific case that prompted my thinking on this. But by way of introduction, because there are several on this call who I don't know, as Peter said, I'm actually based in South Bend and serve as dean for both South Bend and Gary. I'm a med peds physician by training, did my PhD in theological ethics, and did public health training during my fellowship in preventive cardiology. Um, and but more importantly, I'm a girl dad. I'm the father to two daughters. One just finished her freshman year of college, so has just moved back home. So we're kind of recalibrating the energy and parenting norms in the house. And then my younger daughter is a sophomore in high school here in South Bend. And my wife and I have the two girls and three golden retrievers, so we drowned in golden fluff most of the time. There's not a lint roller or vacuum cleaner strong enough to keep up with three golden retrievers. So you cannot see the golden fluff on my clothes today. But anyway, just to let me share my slides. I do have some AV that I'm going to incorporate in here that I could not embed in the slides. So I'm not exactly a Luddite, but some of this will be a little bit cumbersome. So I hope that you will bear with me as I pull this together. Let me see, share screen, here we go. So we are seeing the wrong screen here, right? Now, do you have a slide?
No, yes, perfect. Yep, now we do.
Okay. All right. So, the focus of this talk is on minimal risk and really thinking about how minimal and whose definition of minimal. So let me give a little bit of background. I was asked to opine on an IRB protocol, which was submitted, for which the investigator had judged it to be minimal risk. It involved recruiting as subjects what they deemed as athletic individuals who had demonstrated that they were capable of running, and the procedures involved running on a treadmill. So at a glance, this seems pretty straightforward. Minimal risk, and most people nodded that, yeah, this seems appropriate. So, I think it's important to think about why this assessment of minimal risk matters. Obviously, on the one hand, it determines the level of oversight and that it could be an exempt or an expedited review. And so the level of scrutiny that goes with it is affected by that. Additionally, it has implications for the expectations around informed consent. And in fact, much of the literature really has focused on those implications for informed consent, which is not what I'm going to focus on today. And then I noticed that there are several pediatrics oriented folks on the call today. And it obviously has, the assessment of minimal risk factors into the adjudication of pediatric research, which, if that's what you're hoping for today, that's also not the focus of this talk. But I think the way they break it down, and just at a high level, if it is minimal risk, then consent expectations from parents or surrogates are different than if it's judged to be greater than minimal risk, in which case they look at whether there's the potential for direct benefit or not to the research subject. And so I do think that discrimination is valuable, and I will speak to that a little bit. Additionally, I think the fact that we ask in the protocol submission for the PI's self-assessment actually is potentially dangerous in that it influences the perception of whoever's receiving that protocol in the IRB office or whoever's reviewing it on behalf of the IRB, and that perception and that self-assessment then prejudices or potentially can prejudice the kind of scrutiny that a protocol receives. So to go to the definition, and this definition has been stable in the federal regulations across agencies, but minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So I need to stop sharing and make my first pivot in terms of AV wizardry here. So anyone here a fan of the TV show The West Wing? Peter says he is. Everyone else is hidden, but hopefully there may be someone else who's a fan. So I'm going to take you to a scene from The West Wing. I see Amy Waltz there. Okay. CJ Craig is on a treadmill.
It's all about budgeting your time. This time, this hour, this is my time. 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. I can work out, as you see. I can think about personal matters. I can meet an interesting man. The trick is... What? I think your paper's going.
We could hear the dialogue, but the picture didn't show. So,
Oh no.
but we got the dialogue. We didn't see the punchline. Um, we heard her say that she can do all these things at once, and then somebody said about a beeper or something.
Yeah. Oh, so I'm not sure why the video didn't show, but CJ Craig is in the gym. I don't know if it's in the White House or what, but she's jogging on a treadmill trying to flirt with some guy next to her. Her beeper goes off, and as she looks at her beeper, then she goes off the back of the treadmill and falls. So I'm not sure if the risk is that she's not an athletic individual, she's not capable of running on a treadmill, or just not able to flirt, look at a pager, and run on a treadmill simultaneously. But that scene prompts me to believe that there may be more than minimal risk associated with interactions with a treadmill. So looking at the literature on minimal risk, as I said, there have been efforts in the federal regulations and commentaries they have largely focused on the implications for informed consent. There's also a history of discussion about what should be the norm for whose risk we're talking about. We'll say more about that in a minute. But there's also some body of literature looking at variability and how IRBs assess minimal risk. And this is one of the earlier papers I found on this topic. There have been others that are fairly similar, but this is a paper from 2002 in Academic Emergency Medicine. And it was a study of how IRBs process or respond to minimal risk surveys that were distributed to emergency department providers and individuals in the waiting room about their perceived needs for victims of intimate partner violence. So it was not focused on individuals presenting for evaluation or in the context of intimate partner violence, but surveying those two groups, providers and waiting individuals in the waiting room, about this issue. The same protocol was submitted, contemporaneously to IRBs at 3 different Baltimore area hospitals. One was an academic tertiary care hospital. Another was an inner city community hospital affiliated with an academic institution. And the third was a suburban community hospital with no academic affiliation. This table summarizes kind of how their IRBs processed the protocol. There's no alignment or they did not disclose whether IRB A was affiliated with the academic institution, so they were silent on that. So don't read too much into that, but it gives you the number of working days for final approval, and these were business days, Monday through Friday, excluding recognized federal holidays, how often the IRB meets, and then how they responded with respect to expectations around informed consent. They all agreed ultimately with the assessment of minimal risk. In one instance, they invited the principal investigator to the meeting for dialogue, which that was the most expeditious approach, it seems. And then whether they accepted it as an expedited protocol or not, and whether revisions were required. So you can see that there is an impact certainly on the timeliness of processing the protocol across these IRBs, that they take different approaches on the expectations for informed consent. That's not correlated with the number of revisions required or the timeliness of the response is interesting. But ultimately, and of note, they did go into detail about the in the revisions required by IRBC, virtually all of the questions had to do with kind of scientific rigor and background and research methodology, not about so it was really focused on whether the research was justified rather than anything related to the consent or the minimal risk assessment. But in the conclusion, they state that the IRBs have an obligation to protect subjects, ideally without unduly inhibiting the advancement of medical knowledge. Studies that meet predefined minimal risk should not be subject to excessive time delays. And that emphasis on meet predefined minimal risk is my own, because I think that is largely the crux of the matter. So again, this definition, we'll dig into this a little bit more. So the focus largely is on the likelihood and severity of harm stemming from the research, and the literature really has focused on that. And so if we look at this protocol, again, the PI has deemed it minimal risk. It's recruiting a targeted population of people with at least some level of athleticism, and the only expectation is running on a treadmill. So when we think about the likelihood and severity of risk, it's couched in terms of risks that are ordinarily encountered in daily life. And so, um, again, there's been some discussion in the literature historically about whether that should be a relative concept or an absolute concept. And as an example, the risks ordinarily encountered by firefighters and race car drivers are much greater than the risks associated, encountered in the daily lives of bioethicists and regional campus deans. So my greatest risk, in most of my daily life is maybe a paper cut, but actually my greatest risk is in the conduct of my daily life is getting into a car and driving, or my risk of falling at home in the shower. Although, as one who has experienced a snow shoveling injury, don't underestimate my ability to hurt myself in the most mundane of ways. Conceptually, though, if we adopt a relative approach to assessing these risks, then it would be acceptable to expose firefighters and race car drivers to much riskier research protocols than med school administrators. And so that's problematic. And so the standard has been to assess minimal risk with respect to the risks ordinarily encountered in the daily life of kind of a normal, healthy adult subject, or in the case of pediatrics, pediatric subject. So again, if we think about kind of the risks that we encounter, our risk of driving a car, there are 44,000 deaths in motor vehicle accidents in the United States every year. There's the risk of injury, it's 1.25 per million miles driven or something like that. I mean, so it is an identifiable risk, but for many of us, that may be the riskiest thing that we do. And yet it's a risk that virtually all of us are willing to accept in trade-off for the conduct of our daily lives, right? The risk of falling at home, again, especially for elderly individuals, goes up pretty dramatically. So we assume certain risks in the pursuit of our professional and leisure activities, and there's some inherent risk just in navigating our, whatever our living space is. Conversely, if we look, there is the risk of injury associated with treadmill use. There are about 24,000 treadmill associated injuries that present for evaluation in a healthcare facility every year in the United States. So, less than we see in terms of compared to motor vehicle fatalities, but still an identifiable risk associated with what we think of as a health promoting behavior. So let's look at this protocol a little bit more. So they don't just want athletic individuals, they want athletes capable of running at least 15 miles an hour. So that's a 4-minute mile. They don't require that you sustain it for a mile, but I can maintain 15 miles an hour for about 20 feet probably, and then I drop off dramatically. But again, these are not necessarily just, casual joggers. And there's a presumption that if you can run fast, maybe that you can run, that you can run on a treadmill without undue risk. So, in addition to what standard are we going to use for evaluating the risk in ordinary conduct of daily life, the other parameter in this definition is or the risk during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. I'm going to bracket the psychological examinations and tests, not because I think that's unimportant, but conceptually it's easier to wrap our mind around, what we encounter in a routine physical, perhaps. And actually, I think the IRB standards are more permissive than just the risks of a routine physical. So if I think about a routine physical, again, I'm a med peds physician, so I take care of big babies and little babies. Um, the riskiest things I do, arguably, are putting a speculum in a wiggling 2-year-old's ear. So risk to damaging his eardrum. Most of the rest of the exam is pretty benign. Certainly, if I go into cleaning out earwax with a curette, that risk goes up. And in fact, there's some discussion in the clinical literature whether that's an invasive intervention that requires a separate consent. I don't know of any practice that documents informed consent, requires a written informed consent for that, but several practices I know have taken the step of at least documenting verbal consent from the parent that they understand that there is some risk associated with sticking a curette in the ear. In fact, the literature for IRBs extends this beyond what happens in a routine physical exam to include blood draws of small amounts, and that's for both adults and kids. And so, again, when I first started practicing, there was no additional consent or even acknowledgement of risk in having a routine venipuncture, either in the hospital or in an outpatient setting. I have been accused of being a little bit of an Eeyore and focusing on unintended consequences and worst case scenarios. So I can always spin the scenario where somebody goes for venipuncture and ends up dying by any of a variety of mechanisms. So I think there is some risk even associated with routine venipuncture. And actually, I've now seen at least some outpatient labs that have patients sign that they indicate that there is some risk associated with the procedure. And that was not the case 25 years ago, anyway. All right, so it gets even more interesting. Not only do we want people capable of running fast, but the procedure requires that they run on a treadmill at approximately 90% of their maximum speed. So if you're capable of sprinting at 15 miles an hour, they want you to sprint on the treadmill at least 13 and a half miles an hour. I run on the treadmill in the winter. I don't get anywhere near these speeds. I even do some high interval stuff where I try to crank the speed up, and I still have never gotten close to these speeds. But if CJ Craig can't answer, can't look at a pager while jogging on a treadmill, I would argue that, especially unless you're used to sprinting on a treadmill, that there is a greater risk of sprinting on a treadmill than there would be in sprinting on the ground, or greater than the risk of simply running on a treadmill at whatever your normal pace is. The other piece of this is, if one of our expectations in research is that you can choose to discontinue participation at any time, but I dare you to choose to discontinue participation when the treadmill's going 13 miles an hour. So I reviewed this protocol and I suggested that perhaps it did not meet at least what I would understand as minimal risk, because this seemed to, even for athletic individuals capable of running fast, sprinting on a treadmill seemed to me to carry greater risk than I encounter in my daily life, or than most of these athletic individuals would encounter even in their regular treadmill running sessions. All right, so we're going to go to another video clip. I'm going to hope that this works, or at least that it's another familiar thing that you might have seen on TV. So let me, oh,
Bet you can't run as fast as T-Mobile. Bet you I can. But you better pick it up because T-Mobile now has the fastest 5G home internet. Watch this. Okay. T-Mobile now has the best.
so I don't know if if you could see the video, Peter.
Yes, we could see Zach Braff in all of his hilarity flying off the treadmill again.
So, again, I'm concerned about this assessment of minimal risk because if Zach Braff can't sprint on a treadmill, then I worry about other athletic individuals. So the other part of the definition that I think it's worth paying some attention to, this says, the likelihood and severity of risk anticipated in the research. And I think in our protection of human subjects, that really part of what we're called to do is, again, EOR, to focus on the unintended consequences and think about what some worst case scenarios are. And so I think there is a tendency, particularly on the part of investigators, to, underestimate what some of the risks are. I know I've seen in social and behavioral research, people that say the risk of participating in the survey is being bored or getting a paper cut, or, they almost seem to contrive some risks because they don't perceive, they probably underestimate the risk of stigma and things associated with disclosure in some instances. So there are all sorts of things that they don't accurately project, but they feel like they have to fill in a box, and so they're going to make something up that they may not wholeheartedly believe is actually a risk. But again, I think the risk of underestimating the risk associated with interventions may miss some of those unanticipated consequences. So the final piece in this puzzle is in targeting the athletic individuals, the investigators chose to focus on club rugby players. And while I think they may represent a vulnerable population because of head injuries, the truth of the matter is they focused on that. I think they must have had some in with the rugby club, but they weren't allowed to approach D1 athletes. And so they had to go to some other group of individuals. And they chose rugby players who I don't necessarily think of as the great sprinters, and I don't perceive them as doing a lot of their training on a treadmill. So it seemed curious at best. So in thinking about minimal risk, I think the other piece we have to pay attention to is in the research methodology, really to think about what is the focus of the research question, which is not necessarily what the protocol requires us to do. And so when I say, focusing on the nature of the research question, again, how you adjudicate or how a PI reports in their proposal, their assessment of minimal risk and their perception of whether this should be expedited or exempt. Again, that influences how it may be received by the IRB. But I think it's important to focus on the nature of interactions with subjects. And I'll say more about this in just a second, because I think there is the potential or a risk of misdirection. So I think it's important to think about where does the risk in this protocol lie. So again, in this protocol, they identified it as an expedited protocol, citing category 4, which is dependent on collection of data through non-invasive procedures. And it goes on to say routinely employed in clinical practice. For purposes of this protocol, they're really employing collection of data through non-invasive procedures. So when we look at the risk, I think the designation of minimal risk by the PI and identification of the category for an expedited protocol doesn't focus appropriately on, one, where does the risk lie, but how necessary is that risk? Is the risk intrinsic to answering the research question that you've posed? So, if I want to assess oxygenation in firefighters in the midst of fighting a fire, and I want to put a non-invasive sensor on them to do that, the sensor is not increasing their risk perceptibly in terms of the risk they encounter in fighting the fire. And yet that exposure, that environment is what we're trying to test. We can't test that hypothesis without that risky element, versus whether the risky aspect of the intervention is instrumental to the question being addressed. So there are a number of examples that I excerpted to for the category 4 exemption for expedited protocol. So the first is physical sensors that are applied either to the surface of the body or at a distance. And the second or the fourth in that category is that the intervention involves moderate exercise where appropriate given the age, weight, and health of the individual. So those are just two examples that are embedded in the IRB protocol to indicate things that would merit designation as a category 4 expedited study. So having said that, what this protocol is assessing is actually the accuracy of a wearable sensor for determining the speed of running. So it's been studied in jogging, and the goal was to see whether a sensor dangling from a shoelace versus a sensor strapped to a shoe more accurately reflects the speed at high speed running. And so in the expedited category 4, the focus is on the way data are collected, and it's silent or oblivious to, again, where the risk is. The risk is not in the data collection. So this is collection of data through non-invasive procedures, that is these sensors attached to the shoe. And yet it's not the sensors attached to the shoe that convey the risk to the subjects participating in this research. It is the behavior expected, the intervention that makes it possible to assess the data that they want to look at. And so that's what I'm suggesting. The running fast on a treadmill is instrumental. It's not really foundational to the research question. With these two examples for category 4, again, yes, it's a physical sensor. That's how the data are collected. The exercise they're exposing them to may be more than moderate. But I would argue that rugby players may not be the most suitable population for this because sprinting on a treadmill may not be part of their routine training. Um, the other piece, and I don't know if there are any lawyers on this call today, but I'm uh, curious about, this phrase in the definition that the probability and magnitude of harm is not greater or are not greater in and of themselves. So considered on their own merits or considered by themselves are not greater than those encountered. And so this idea of in and of themselves, um, there's no guidance that I could find in all the commentaries on this of how IRBs should even interpret that. So I'm going to stop sharing there. But so, as I assess this protocol, part of me wonders, is this fundamentally a recruitment problem? And that if we were to try to recruit people from, the gym who run regularly on a treadmill, and particularly those who run fast or do high intensity intervals on the treadmill, so who regularly sprint on a treadmill, that might be a more acceptable target for recruitment. And yet, even to do that, acknowledges that our recruitment strategy defines our relative definition of what risks of daily life are we willing to accept, or that we believe to pass muster within the IRB. Um, so, I think there are several layers to this. I think the recruitment may be simply a strategy to try to make ourselves feel better. But in point of fact, I would suggest that, except for a few instances where they're largely observational studies, there are very few things that truly meet that definition of minimal risk, um, not to exceed risks encountered in ordinary conduct of daily life. Um, but focusing on data collection as a basis misses the mark because it misses where the risk accrues. Um, and in that respect, I think actually the pediatric algorithm is certainly more honest. It recognizes that there is a relatively small group of things that truly are minimal risk. Most things, most protocols will carry some inherent risk that is at least somewhat greater than minimal risk, probably not undue, and certainly things that reasonable people can make decisions on and choose to participate in. But I think there needs to be something between everything is minimal risk except for chemotherapy protocols, and we're going to make you go to the full board and sign a 23-page consent form or something. I think there's a lot that actually does carry more than minimal risk that we have not yet found the right way to navigate. Certainly the IRB process, to whether we allow a waiver of written informed consent, may be a nod to that. And yet, I think implicit in that nod, we should at least acknowledge that this carries a somewhat greater than minimal risk. So I will stop there and would welcome feedback, comments.
Bravo. Bravo, Mark.
Bravo, Mark. Thank you. I have to say what I did not say at the beginning, which you actually hit right on time, which is these are supposed to be at most 30 or 40 minutes, leaving us time for some conversation. I think you've raised some great issues. I will say there is one lawyer on the that I know on the call, Amy Waltz, who used to run our IRB here. And Amy, if you want to say anything about the legal question he asked, feel free. I have some questions, but I'll leave it open for the room. First, anybody who has a question or a comment on this issue and the issues and approach that Mark recommended, Dr. Fox recommended.
And Mark is fine, please.
Mark. Peter says Mark. Mark says Peter. I'll ask one question to get started. I'd say the um what was I gonna say? So So I love that we did this topic. I love that you did this topic, Mark, because I do agree with you that it's a key issue. And it's a key issue for research ethics, right? Because when you subject people to nothing greater than their normal risk, and again, I love that you raised all the complexity of that, then we can feel good about research. I mean, I think as an essential ethics issue we run up against in human subjects research all the time, that IRB runs against and we run against, which is that people are doing something for other people's good by the definition of research and taking on risk themselves. And when that risk is a certain level, as you mentioned, the pediatric, it can only be at the minimal or slightly above minimal. Then it's a whole different ball game than when you're asking them to take a higher risk, and the whole game in this ball game comes down to just defining that. So I love that you asked this. I love the treadmill. Now, the treadmill, you pointed out the risks of a treadmill, and I got the sense your implication was we shouldn't think of this as minimal risk. I was tempted to take it the other way, which is that ordinary life, as you said, is not 100% safe. So you can make it seem like all research is incredibly risky because all of life has risks. Or you could just acknowledge that normal life has risks. And so when people do certain kinds of research, they really are not taking on a great burden or risk. And so we can feel good about the ethics of it because they've been hopefully consented and they've been, allowed to volunteer. Maybe they've been paid even, which I assume is what the rugby team may be looking for when they run on the treadmill. And that's all okay because they're taking on the risks we all take on in normal life. So is that where you came down, or did you feel at the end of this like you were nervous about treadmills in a way in which you just were not before? Or did you feel like, maybe if this was done right, I think there were some really great points you raised about how to do this right. It could be done appropriately without a big concern.
Yeah. For me, I think um, the notion of sprinting on a treadmill markedly increases the risk of running on a treadmill. So again, a lot of people run on a treadmill. Maybe the club rugby players run on a treadmill. Not many people sprint on a treadmill. So, um, I think the rationale for treadmill was purported to be that they could calibrate the speed. The is the speed documented by the sensor matching the speed on the treadmill? If you have a treadmill that's calibrated better than most hotel fitness centers, right? So I run a lot faster outside than I do on a hotel treadmill. But I even think that sprinting on level ground outside or on an indoor track is inherently safer than sprinting on a treadmill. Um,
Can
and
I,
so,
you're suggesting, I think that this study could have minimized the risk more, right?
absolutely, yeah.
It's not enough just to claim this general category of a treadmill running, which sounds so safe, but then you're pointing out it's not so safe given how they wanted to do it. Maybe they need to, time them across level ground or recruit different people. It's not okay to say, okay, I'm under minimal risk if I describe it this way, but actually take those risks very seriously in a way that maybe not everybody was. I love it. Other,
But I think and I'd love to hear from Amy on this. I think at first glance, whoever's looking at this for an IRB could just say, huh, athletes running on a treadmill, that seems fine. And when you dig into the details and say, huh, running at 13 miles an hour on a treadmill, um, that that feels very different to me.
Yeah, I'll be happy to jump in. So as Peter said, I was involved in the leadership of the IU-IRB for several years. I do research misconduct now, and have for the past several years. But I think this is an interesting point because I think there is a difference between whether or not a study is minimal risk and whether or not the risks have been minimized. I think those two are different things and different it's a different thought process for both of those things. Your question about, those specific words in the minimal risk definition about in and of themselves. Um, I agree. I don't think those words are not words we have typically focused on in the IRB space. It is, r risk is the hardest thing, I think, for IRBs to handle. This question of whether or not a study is minimal risk and whether or not the risks have been minimized. I think you could say in this particular case, I think you could make a justification that in this case, running on a treadmill is minimal risk. So I want to say in and of itself, because it seems like running on a treadmill typically is minimal risk. It seems like that is something that is, you would encounter in your normal everyday life. Like maybe not everybody runs on treadmills, but lots of people do. That is a typical activity for normal everyday life. So it seems like that in itself is that activity in itself is minimal risk. But the question I think is when you're thinking, when an IRB is thinking about the criteria for approval, have you minimized those risks that are there? And I think that is a very separate question and a separate consideration that the IRB reviewers would have to go through. I feel like I said all of that just more than once, so I don't know if that was helpful.
No, that's a very helpful distinction.
And I think also, Amy, the thing you're raising about minimizing risk is that there may be a trade-off with the ease of completing the study, right? Doing it on land, on ground, level ground, the way Mark is suggesting, and I'd be requiring that. I assume the investigator is going to say, "Oh my God, don't make us do that. On a treadmill, we can just set, the speed, and we know the speed on the treadmill, and then we know if our device is working well." And a hard-nosed IRB, Mark Fox's IRB, is gonna be like, "Hey, I hear you. It would be easier, but it's not so hard to do it on level ground. You just have to time them and time them well, over whatever quarter mile and see if they made the right speed. And it's not the end of the world, but we're going to maximize safety in order to minimize risk, even within this context of minimal risk." And I assume, again, this is this very hard trade-off in research ethics in general. What is achieving the beneficence goal of still achieving the research end, but maximizing protection for subjects? That trade-off there is, in this case, very specific. Will you do it on a treadmill? A little more dangerous. Will you do it on level ground? Perhaps a little safer, a little more difficult to get the right answer or a clear answer.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. IRB review, in my mind, is a lot about trade-off. It's a lot about balancing, competing interests and balancing, this, we want to do research and we need this information with how much do we put participants at risk. So I think this was an interesting perspective on minimal risk, Mark. And I love your thought that recruitment very much plays into this. I think who you're recruiting and the subject, the potential participants that you are focused on and targeting is part of that minimizing risk. It might not change whether or not the study is minimal risk, but it certainly, I think, speaks to whether or not the researcher is minimizing the risk.
Well, Amy and I can talk all day, as can Mark, but how about others for thoughts or questions about minimal risk? Do you feel comfortable with this? Do you feel this is clear enough for use, something you can take forward in your work? Any thoughts?
So, Mark, I have a question, which is it's not bioethics related at all. It's more just about the study specifically. Do you know if were they just using, your typical, run-of-the-mill treadmills, or were they using like the specific manual ones for sprinting? Because I know there's a style out there that's designed, for sprint workouts, whereas, if you miss a step or whatever, it's not going to fling you off and result in as bad of injury as just a normal treadmill. So I don't know if you knew which one they were using.
Um, off the top of my head, I do not recall. Certainly there was nothing in it to suggest that it was a specialized treadmill for sprinting. But I don't remember specifics about manufacturer model or
Yeah. Yeah. Again, another way to minimize the risk that could be added for
yeah,
an IRB member who's like, look, I am the advocate for the participant. You researcher proposing this will be very quick to say it's minimal risk, but the idea of an advocate on an IRB is to express that concern. Yeah. Tom, do you want to speak your comment, Tom, or do you want us to read it? Tom is staying on. Oh, he's coming off mute. No, maybe he's not. Tom put a question in chat. Tom, come on. If you don't want to hear me read it, you have to read it. Do you want to read it, Mark, and consider what you want to say about it? For those
sure.
chat open, Tom is asking, risks in normal life is subjective in two dimensions. Risk and what is risky is a subjective judgment. So is the idea of normal life, as I think Mark said a little bit about that. Given this, I'm led to believe the minimum risk IRBs is largely going to depend on how many EORs on the IRB there are. Do you think there can be a good working definition for minimal risk? So, Mark, are you a skeptic as to the use of this concept? Do we need to get rid of it? Or do we need to define it a different way? If we got rid of it, of course, the question would be, what do you do then? Do you not allow any pediatric research? Because right now our judgment is it's only really allowable, easily allowable when risk is minimal or close to minimal. Do you never allow, I mean, what would you do without it? How skeptical are you of the ability to make it a workable, reliable, ethical concept? I think Tom is challenging us with that. Do we have to
Yeah.
what's the risk of minimal risk?
No, I think that's a great question because again, the conceptually you run the risk that the burden of participation in research is um, not fairly distributed because we could argue that people with inherently risky occupations, that it's fair game to subject them to riskier research protocols. I don't think that's the position we want to land in. And yet, as Amy said, in terms of minimizing risk, if we target our recruitment not to dumb, clunky rugby players, but to, the former high school sprinter who maybe is more comfortable sprinting on a treadmill, that minimizes the risk. I think the question that I've not seen satisfactorily answered, and maybe I've just missed it or ignored it, but when we say that the risks associated with the research are no greater than what you would encounter in your daily life. So I have accepted the level of risk of my daily life, of my, 5 mile commute each way, or actually my risk is much greater since I'm now Dean and Gary because I commute, an hour each way several times a week. So I spend a lot more time at high speed traveling greater distance on the toll road. I have assumed that risk in my daily life. So is it that the risk is, as I said, the risk of running on a treadmill is lower than the risk of, showering or of driving a car. So is it compared to everything else in your life, the risk is lower and that makes it okay? Or I think it's that the incremental risk of being subjected to the interventions required in this protocol don't put you over a threshold. So I do think, the goal ought to be to in reasonable ways minimize risk, but to ensure that people with, decision-making capacity have the opportunity to fairly assess that risk and make the decision about whether or not to participate. And so, I actually think in some ways the focus on minimal risk may be misguided. There, again, in almost any interventional protocol, there is some risk associated with it. Some of them are trivial, but a lot of times they're not. And yet, certainly, we want people to participate in research. We want to protect them to the extent that we can, and we want to give them the freedom to make good or bad choices for themselves. So if a young rugby player for no compensation wants to sprint on a treadmill, that's up to them. I was glad I went back actually just this week to look at the protocol again to remind myself of whether there was any compensation involved because I wanted to ensure that there had not been some even potential for altering one's decision structure by the presence of some compensation. No compensation for this.
So I gotta push back a little bit here. We have to watch the time. We'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. In that there is a place, I think, for judging some research to be so safe that we are going to make it easier to make it happen. I mean, I think again, just like we worry about the trade-offs, as Amy was saying, between beneficence and risk, beneficence to subjects, importance of getting research done. Let's say a survey study. Now you might say, well, gee, I want to make sure just, the sort of the model you sort of suggested there, Mark, I'm not sure you meant to go all this way, was nothing is minimal risk, or just drop that idea from your head and just to make sure you explain to everybody the risks they'll be facing in the study, to allow them to decide whether to participate. Make sure you do a good job on consent. Two sides to that. One is that that's a lot of talking for a survey study. Like, let's talk about what the risks. You could get a paper cut, or you could be uncomfortable. Like you said, the researchers throw that in there because it sounds like something. Um, but what does it really mean? I mean, I think we can all hopefully, I mean, hopefully that's not a big risk in most survey studies. The other side of it is also, do you really trust people to decide on the risk level themselves? And once you blur the distinction between minimal and above minimal, say, well, we know people aren't very good at deciding about risk themselves. So I don't know. It's interesting that you bring that up as a potential way to move forward, given the concerns about how to define it. I was going to say I don't think we should keep saying that firefighters would be what is it? Recruiting in order to choose people who will have lower risk is certainly a good idea, as a goal. Recruit runners rather than people who haven't run in 5 years, because maybe there's lower risk for runners as long as that risk is minimized. But saying, well, you're a firefighter, so your everyday life includes more risk. I don't think anybody uses that idea that like you have to relativize the idea of risks of daily life to individuals. I don't think you've ever heard an IRB try that out. Like, well, it's a person who takes a lot of risks, so this study is minimal risk for him, even though it wouldn't be minimal risk for somebody else. Is that something you actually have come across, or more just like a thought experiment about how to use this?
No, more historical literature is a thought experiment about the distribution of burdens of participation. I, I do agree that are there are certain protocols that absolutely the risks are bland and most survey much survey research would fall into that category. So yeah, I'm not trying to suggest that, but um, when we're exposing people to an intervention, I think maybe where we go wrong is in asking the PI's opinion on the front end. So I think that colors the perception, but also, um, you know, depending on where your IRB is situated, I think the sophistication with which the protocol is assessed varies. So, being in an environment that doesn't have a big academic medical center, doesn't have, a lot of clinical trial interventions that, you know, just inherently are perceived as carrying more risk. Um, I think there's a risk that people will say, this doesn't involve, brain biopsies or, you know, chemotherapy. So, not digging into those details. Again, I think, the initial review of this protocol, it would be easy just to say, yeah, running on a treadmill. I do that every weekend. No problem. And when you really look at the details, it certainly gave me pause.
I love it. And using the idea of minimal risk to paper over the need to minimize risk
Right.
is really an important take-home message today. And come to the bioethics group and get a consultation from any of us EORs, including Mark or me or Seamus or other people on this call. or they've left the call, I think now. And we will be happy to talk to you about risk and minimizing your risk in your studies and think about how to do your research as ethically as possible. So let me just end there and thank Mark for this excellent conversation. And I'll thank also Seamus and Emma for some background research they did for Mark
Absolutely.
on the literature. And I think that's a great model and something great to go forward. And see you all next time. I think we have our next treats talk. Oh God, I think it's me. Is that right, Seamus? Yeah, I think it's me in the
It
fall.
is
So,
you. It is you.
okay. Okay, good.
All right. Well, I would like to echo the thanks to Seamus and Emma, and thank you all for being here for the talk.